Higher pay for politicians means a higher tax bill. It's that simple. In BC, we're seeing the government bring in more and more and more taxes at a time when literally no one can afford them.
Hey everyone, I'm Franco Terrazzano, the federal director and spokesperson for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation here in Ottawa. I'm joined by my friend and colleague Carson Binda, holding down the fort in beautiful British Columbia. Now, Carson, we always hear stories about politicians wanting to milk taxpayers, but actually something kind of good was happening in BC there for a second. We had a politician who was trying to take less from taxpayers. What was going on there?
Well, Franco, a politician trying to save us money might sound a little bit crazy, like pigs learning to fly, or hell, the Canucks winning the Stanley Cup this year.
Whoa.
But that's exactly what's happening in British Columbia right now. Opposition MLA Todd Stone brought forward a private member's bill to freeze politician pay. It would kill the $10,000 pay raises we're going to see this April. The government killed it. The government wouldn't even allow the bill to be brought up for debate. Last Thursday, we had the last sitting of the Legislative Assembly for this year, and without having debated the bill, it's going to be wiped from the order paper on the first day of the next sitting in February. So the politicians, they're giving themselves a $10,000 raise. They heard from thousands and thousands of our supporters across British Columbia asking them just to debate the bill. But all our supporters heard back, Franco, was crickets. Now, thanks to our supporters, this has been all over the news here in BC, but the government isn't allowing this bill to be brought forward for debate.
All right, so let me just get this straight. You had one politician who deserves some credit here, Mr. Todd Stone, who's trying to stop a pay raise. He brought forward a private member's bill, but the government shut it down. So now they're going to be taking an extra $10,000 in salary next year. Now, Carson, you'd think that there'd be more than just one MLA who would understand that now is not exactly the best time to be giving themselves a raise.
Absolutely, Franco, but this was all about optics as far as the government was concerned. If there was any debate whatsoever on this bill and the government voted against it, the government MLAs knew. They knew that would make them look bad. They knew that it's unacceptable for politicians to be voting to give themselves pay raises. The government wanted to kill this legislation, and they knew the only way they could kill it by saving face was by waiting out the clock, which is exactly what they did here.
You know, call me crazy, but if you don't want to look bad, don't do bad things. If you don't want to look bad, don't give yourself a pay raise coming from the pockets of taxpayers who are struggling. Okay, but let's get into the nuts and bolts here, Carson. Let's dive a little deeper into the policy. You say that these BC politicians are going to be giving themselves an extra $10,000, but why don't you just break down exactly what it is the MLAs and the Premier in British Columbia are already making?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. The MLAs in Victoria are giving themselves a $10,000 pay raise on April 1st. It's a lot of money, and it's coming at a terrible time. As far as I'm concerned, this is probably the most tone-deaf thing that the Victoria politicians and bureaucrats could possibly be doing right now.
That's saying a lot.
It is. Right now, backbench MLAs, they make about $115,000 a year just in base salary. The Premier, now he makes about $220,000 a year. Again, that's just base salary. When we're talking about politician pay, you and I both know that base salary is just the tip of the iceberg. On top of base salary, these politicians take home about $22,800 every single year for their housing allowance. Well, then there's the per diem on top of that. Just to come to Victoria and sit in the legislature, just to do their jobs, MLAs take home around an additional $61 a day, which shakes out to about $4,300 per legislative session. Well, then there's the travel expenses we need to talk about, Franco. We've got documents showing that just one government MLA billed taxpayers more than $12,000 in mileage for driving around his constituency. And here's the kicker. It was in an electric car. So yeah, they already receive very, very generous compensation from taxpayers. And now they're just giving themselves another $10,000 more a year.
Hold on a second. You said that an MLA, a backbencher, while collecting dust, is also collecting $115,000 a year salary. The premier is getting $220,000 a year base salary. But then you also mentioned a per diem. So just extra cash on top of their salary just to do their job, which presumably is what the salary is being paid for. What?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Franco. A backbencher already makes $115,000 a year, which is going to be topped off with an extra $10,000 pay raise on April 1st. Add on another $22,800 for housing allowances, and your backbench MLA is in line for about $147,800 next year. On top of that, they are paid $61 for every single day that they are outside of their constituency on government business. The legislature sits in Victoria for about 70 days in a normal year, which means that just for showing up to work, these MLAs are collecting an extra $4,300.
You'd think that there'd just be more politicians who would be saying enough is enough. And, we need to respect the taxpayers' money right now. And that now would really be the worst possible time to be giving themselves a pay raise.
Yeah, it's truly disgusting, Franco. And, unfortunately, we're seeing politicians taking pay raises, not just here in BC, but across the country. Now, federal MPs, they make $189,500, which is 10 grand more than they did before the start of the pandemic. Cabinet ministers, well, they gave themselves a $15,000 raise, meaning that they're now making more than $279,900 a year. Last year, Trudeau, well, he took home a cool $372,000. In Ontario now, Ford didn't exactly give his MLAs a blanket pay raise, but what he did do was increase the amount of parliamentary secretaries as a backdoor way of giving his political friends a raise. But you know what? There's also some good news at the provincial level. In Nova Scotia, they recalled Parliament to prevent a politician's raise. In Alberta, MLAs, the Premier, and every single UCP staffer all took pay cuts to save the taxpayers' money right now.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly have seen some good news. The thing with Alberta is that we saw their MLAs before the pandemic in the summer of 2019. They took a 5% pay cut. The premier, Mr. Kenney at the time, took a 10% pay cut. And then you had the UCP staffers during the pandemic. They took a 7% pay cut. So certainly it's not certainly it's not the law of gravity that raises and pay raises always have to happen in government. The CTF identified 30 jurisdictions around the world that cut pay at some point during the pandemic. In New Zealand, you actually saw their prime minister, their ministers, and their top bureaucrats all take a 20% pay cut right at the beginning of the pandemic to show solidarity with the struggling taxpayers who are paying their salaries. Now, Carson, a constant message throughout this whole little back and forth you and I have going on here is that the problem is that when politicians give themselves a raise, that in effect is coming from taxpayers' pockets at one point in time. Why don't you kind of explain that little nuance for our listeners?
Well, at the end of the day, higher pay for politicians means a higher tax bill. It's that simple. In BC, we're seeing the government bring in more and more and more taxes at a time when literally no one can afford them. Last month, the provincial government raised taxes on used cars. They're also introducing a new tax if you renovate a home. It's crazy, Franco. It's absolute craziness. Do you remember seeing $240 per liter fuel prices at gas stations in BC? I do. Well, that 75-cent carbon tax, it's also set to jet right up in April. Same thing applies right across Canada. And remember, politicians need to push for savings in the bureaucracy. But it'll be hard for politicians to tell bureaucrats to find savings when they're just lining their pockets with an extra $10,000 a year. And of course, Franco, there's the tale of two downturns we've seen since the very beginning of this pandemic. Government, bureaucrats, they have it fine. Everyone else has been struggling. 1 in 5 Canadians are skipping meals. There's record-breaking demand at food banks. Now is not the time for politicians to be giving themselves a pay raise. It's that simple.
Yeah, should be a no-brainer. I mean, I heard you say a stat, 75 cents a liter. In Vancouver, listeners, no, seriously, if you add up all the provincial and federal gas taxes and even municipal that you're paying in Vancouver, it's about 75 cents a liter that is just in taxes. All we see is taxes going up, and up. And unfortunately, politician pay is also going up, and up. Carson, good job holding these politicians accountable in your neck of the woods.
Thanks so much, Franco. It's always a pleasure to be on here chatting with you.